This is Ari Koretsky, and welcome to Jews You Should Know, introducing the broader community to interesting and inspiring Jewish men and women making a difference in our world. Some are already famous, some not yet so, but each is a Jew you should know.
Welcome, everyone. A few weeks back, I had the great privilege of interviewing a brilliant scientist, Dr. Jeremy England, currently a professor at MIT. And coincidentally enough, a couple weeks later, I had again the opportunity to speak with another brilliant physicist, this time astrophysicist Brian Keating, a professor at the University of California, San Diego, author of a newly released or soon to be released book called Losing the Nobel Prize. The juxtaposition of these two features is purely coincidental, although perhaps God had plans in mind. But I think it's actually a wonderful confluence because the two are both incredibly riveting, thoughtful, profound, and different. And to hear them almost back to back is a real treat and a real unique opportunity for our listeners. Coming up in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a feature with Hotels.com founder Bob Diener, a fascinating man, very accomplished, not only in business, but in Jewish ethics as well. And then we're going to have some special guests focused on Israel, including Ambassador Ron Dermer, among others, ahead of Yom HaAtzmaut, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, let's go to today's guest. We are here with astrophysicist Brian Keating, a professor at the University of California at San Diego, a pioneering cosmologist, and author of a book about to be released, or perhaps by the time you're listening to this, already released, book called Losing the Nobel Prize. How are you, Dr. Keating?
I'm very well. How are you, Rabbi?
Doing wonderful, thank God. So give us a little bit of background. I know that you are today, as I said, a pioneering cosmologist, a renowned physicist, but I imagine you didn't start that way. So where were you born? What was your early childhood like?
Yeah, I started off as a phys ed instructor and a cosmetologist, and I just lapsed into the. No, So I began my astronomical astrophysics career way back in the early and mid 1980s when I was a kid growing up on the East Coast in Dobbs Ferry, which is north of New York City in Westchester County. And one night I had awakened in the middle of the night thinking I had left the light in my closet on and wondering how I fell asleep with this enormously powerful luminary glaring at me. And yet when I got up, I found that the light in the closet was off. But outside there was this enormous round moon. And next to the moon, that was full moon, I saw this mesmerizingly bright star. And I just couldn't comprehend what that star could possibly be in order to be visible next to this, this superluminary lunar object. And, this is a couple of years before Google, more than a decade before Google. So I couldn't exactly, Google it as we would do nowadays, 1986, 1987. And so I had to wait. I had to wait until the New York Times came out on Sunday. And I picked it up and I looked in the back of the section that was entitled Cosmos, where they showed what the starry night sky would look like. And I saw it was the moon, and next to the moon, the most likely thing that it was the planet Jupiter. And I just couldn't comprehend. That blew my mind that you could see the Hebrew planet, Jupiter. You could see the planet, another world, with your naked eye, without a spaceship or a telescope. So I just got hooked. I felt like it was so amazing to see these with the naked eye, and I could only imagine what it might look through using a telescope. But I had relatively meager means at the time and wasn't able to afford massive optical system. So what I had to do is continue working. I was working over the summer, and then I got a supplement from a funding agency. You're on the East Coast, right near Washington D.C., and out there they have all the NASA, they have the NSF, the DOE, the DOE, the DOD, all these three-letter acronyms. So I had to appeal to the MOM Foundation, my mother, and she generously supplemented my meager research account. So I became a a principal investigator is what we call people who get to use the telescopes nowadays. So I was able to buy a tiny little telescope and immediately got a thrilling view, even more mesmerizing than when I saw these objects with my eye. And
how old were you in this story?
I was 12 years old. I was about to be 13. I was about to become a bar mitzvah, but I'm sure we'll get into that subject later on too. But when I actually was able to use the telescope for the first time and point it at just wherever I could see with the naked eye, it was just phenomenal, because you could see things that you couldn't even believe would exist. Not only did we have a moon, but Jupiter had a moon, and it had 4 moons, and that you could see with this tiny little telescope. And the moon wasn't a smooth, glowing disk. It was filled with craters and mountains, and you could tell where asteroids and meteoroids had hit it. It's just phenomenal to see it. And I saw the rings of Saturn, and you can see that there's multiple rings of it. It looks like it has ears on it. It's just phenomenal. And then I saw its moon. So I collected 6 moons, added 5 moons to my collection of moons in just a day or two. And it was just an amazing thing that you could reach out through this very simple device and capture images of distant worlds. It was just
I'm
breathtaking.
curious, what did this telescope cost back in the mid-1980s?
Back in those days, yeah, this is pre-Amazon. So I probably had to get it at Sears, not known for their, colossal selection of astronomical equipment. It was I think it was about $80 at the time, which was pretty expensive.
Nice.
Yeah.
That was nice from the MOM.
Yeah, the MOM Foundation.
That's beautiful. So now around this time, I guess, did you take that pursuit very seriously into your school work? Did it immediately translate into like a formal engagement, a formal academic pursuit?
It became, apparent to me that I was interested in scientific and technical things, although I was not put on a track. I was a good student in kind of the humanities subjects at that, throughout my childhood. I was a good reader, a good writer, but I've never been particularly had an affinity for mathematics or science, except to, torture frogs or something like that. Or, when we get to do
they say that may presage a serial killer. So
That's right.
I'll edit that out.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Don't forward that on. So I was able to, kind of translate this visual kind of appreciation for these objects into a formal, more mathematical and quantitative pursuit of them. And that made it really interesting to me to figure out, well, you could actually measure how far apart the stars are from the Earth. And you could do that using basically geometry and trigonometry and things, so I had to appeal to get into to the more advanced math class that would take me on to the calculus and beyond level. And I wasn't able to do that, all at once. It took some time to do that. And then, I became a very strong science student at that time. But I never thought for a moment that I could become a professional astronomer. I thought it was like, being a wizard. No one's going to pay me to do that, or like professional video game tester. I know that such careers exist, and probably some of your clientele that you that listen.
Sorry, my college students some of them major in that. So
yeah, exactly, that's right. So now it wasn't clear to me at all that you could be a professional astronomer, that somebody would pay me to do this, and now I say, they pay me, not so much, but they do pay me. And yet it's a job I would do for free, but don't tell Jerry Brown, my boss, because I have some ideas what to do with that money.
There you go. So where, I assume you went to college afterwards to study this, this arena, I guess, astrophysics or
yes,
aerospace. And Maryland, where I work, it's aerospace engineering. Where did you go to school, and did you get more deeply invested at that point?
Yeah, so I went to college in Cleveland, Ohio, called Case Western Reserve University. It's mostly a technically focused school in one hand, very strong liberal arts as well, and medical school and stuff. But primarily, I'd gone in originally as an astronomy major. I thought it would be so cool to be able to do that. And yet when I got there, I found that college astronomy was too ethereal. It was too philosophical. It was too, kind of just concerned about more simple kind of matters, or in some sense more, as I said, weighty philosophical issues without any tangibility, and the Tockless wasn't there. It wasn't something you could really grasp. I like to build things. I was always good at working on my car, working on models, building airplanes, massive Lego projects, but I wasn't able to get that satisfaction from, just merely this theoretical pursuit. So I wanted something more concrete, more practical. Plus, I still wasn't convinced I could get a job as an astronomer, but I knew people always needed engineering, as you mentioned. And so I decided I would switch my focus of my studies to major in mechanical engineering. And there I found the antidote to all things, theoretical, philosophical. I was really very much concerned with the practical details and memorization of rote concepts and equations and formulae without any, in my mind, creativity. And so I looked and hungered really for a compromise between these two different approaches, between the purely rote, memorize, this formula, etc., approach of engineering disciplines and application of those disciplines, and then between that and the purely theoretical realm of astronomy. And I found that in experimental physics, and that is what I later majored in. So I became a physics major, and that's sort of the average between the astronomy and an engineering disciplines is experimental physics. And then my subspecialty when I went to graduate school at Brown University was in experimental cosmology, which means that we do experiments on the entire universe. No, we don't do that. We can't actually do an experiment as a cosmologist. For one thing, there's only one universe. So what are you going to compare the results of your experiment to? Even if you could take Hashem's eye view, God's eye view of the universe and do tricks on it, you still really wouldn't be able to get a meaningful, what they would call statistically significant result, because there's only one entity, at least so far as things stood about 20 years ago when I got into cosmology.
I was going to ask, does that mean you're not a multiverse guy? Is that?
Well, I always say, trying to debate the debate between those adherents of the multiverse hypothesis and the opponents of the multiverse hypothesis makes the Israeli-Palestine conflict, some very simple and like an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So there's very much heated debate about that. My philosophy there is agnostic in the sense that you should not presage your, opinion based on your own internal desires of your heart, of your eyes, of your mind, what you want to see, and that leads to this very perilous situation of what's called confirmation bias,
sure,
psychological predilection to select favorable evidence that comports with your hypothesis and reject evidence that disagrees with it under the guise of doing it all scientifically and outlier rejection, et cetera. So, I think the multiverse hypothesis is very interesting. I think it's ultimately, potentially represents a challenge to science and scientists who believe in it, because I think you need sort of a certain amount of emunah, faith, to believe in something which almost by definition can't be tested. It lies outside the realm of our universe and inaccessible in many ways. And some of the predictions so the multiverse hypothesis, I should mention for your listeners, is the one that conjectures that our universe is not alone, just as we are not the only planet in the solar system, just as our star is not the only star in the galaxy, just as our galaxy is but one of maybe 500 billion galaxies in the observable universe. Well, just keep extending this Copernican reasoning chain, and you would get that perhaps our universe is not the only universe. And for some people, in particular secular scientists, that's very appealing because it offers a possibility for the creation of the universe from nothing, so to speak, and that this would then make our universe just a happy accident that happens to support biological conscious life such as us. So there are people that believe that hypothesis, and they actually believe for the first time there's mathematical evidence for it called the theory of inflation. And yet there are others who believe that we shouldn't be so quick to assume that that's true, in particular, merely because it might comport with what we believe to be the hidden, inscrutable beginning of the universe.
I want to dive more into your perspective on those issues, and especially as they relate to Judaism and religion in general. But I want to really rewind first and go back to understanding where you were from a religious, theological, spiritual perspective early on as a 12-year-old young man, child, gazing through that $80, MOM sponsored telescope. Where were you standing on the religious spectrum at that point?
So, like many, of my fellow members of my Orthodox synagogue's board of directors, at age 13, I was an altar boy in a Catholic church. So I know
Typical trajectory, yeah.
Yeah, I know that you have a very similar history. But in all seriousness, that is actually my religious world line did originate. Well, I should start from the very beginning. When my parents had me, they were both born. Biological parents are both Jewish, but they weren't practicing. They would maybe go to temple once a decade or so, and it wasn't predominantly important. My father was essentially an atheist, and my mother was, she was, she had enough things to deal with the two of us, my elder brother and myself. So I think she just wasn't really particularly interested. Very culturally Jewish, we'd go to Pesach Seder. We would get together with the Jewish side of the family, for all the major Jewish holidays. But it was really just to eat. That was the tie that bound us together. And then my parents got divorced and separated and divorced. And when I was about 7, my mother remarried, and she remarried an Irish Catholic man named Keating. So my original birth name was Axe, A-X. My father's name was James Axe. And she remarried. I lived with her. And my older brother and I live with her, and so we took on her new married name, which is Keating. So that's why I have the.
You must have been young at that point.
I was only 7 or 8 at the time, yeah. And in contradistinction to my biological parents' lack of Jewish observance, my stepfather's family was, they were Haredi, they were seriously observant Roman Irish Catholics, and they would go to mass every weekend, and they would go on every Sunday and every holiday. And, when I was here, I was, for a while I was getting both holidays, I was getting Hanukkah and Xmas presents, and I was getting, from my Jewish, side of the family, get a Matchbox car, or belt, at age 8, that wasn't so good compared to the Evel Knievel racing set, jump over the Grand Canyon, I get for the Christian holidays. So, so it was, in a simplistic sense, it was very much more appealing. And from a real, true point of view, I mean, the Jewish side of my family was not very happy when my mother married a Gentile and had us converted to Catholicism at a baptism. And this is all, 10, 11, 12, confirmation, all the whole thing. And, I'm kind of I'm all or nothing in some sense. I like to do things right. And I realized, if I really wanted to go all the way as a Catholic, I kind of had to start early. And so I went to become an altar boy with the priest at our Catholic church in Chappaqua. We were living in Chappaqua, New York at the time.
Before Hillary and Bill.
Yeah, this is right. Yeah, exactly. They were the later day neighbors, carpetbagging neighbors. So they, so every Sunday I would go to the to church, and I would pass the communion wafers out, and I would pass the basket, and I would listen to the sermons, and the Monsignor, Father Skelly, he was an amazing guy. He was super brilliant, charming, funny, witty, older guy. He reminded me of like my grandfather or something. Just super kind, warm, and the audience was packed, and it was just, the fellowship really appealed to me. And this is at age 13, so I never prepared for a bar mitzvah. I still have never had officially a bar mitzvah ceremony. My oldest son wants me to have one every year. I think he thinks
we can do something on the podcast right now.
Oh, really? You get the rabbi discount. That's right.
That's it, baby. For the very low price of
yeah, Jews, you should bar mitzvah.
I love it.
Right. So I ended up, getting really into that. And that, as you remember, was the time I got my first telescope. And so I started this confluence of religion and science kind of all occurred within me at the same time. And it would turn out that science would sort of win, in the sense that I became much more interested in science and scientific discoveries than I did. First of all, I was pretty daunted by, I knew it would be hard, if impossible, to become a professional astronomer, as I said. But I knew, and that was just, because it's such a rare position to have in society. I don't even know anyone who was an astronomer at the time. But I knew people who were priests, and I knew what was required to become a priest. And, as you'll probably recall from when you were 13, a year old boy, it's not the thing you're most, fixated on in terms of, job description requirements. So I didn't think I could remain, Shomer Nagia and be in isolation from women for my whole life. So that was one element in the decision to, the reduction of my observance as a religious practicing Catholic.
Did you experience direct, like, sort of contradictions intellectually, or was it more just like you could only put your attention in one area?
No, I don't think I experienced anything intellectually that I felt was wrong with it. And I'll come back to that hopefully later on, because I feel like a lot of religious, men and women, especially our fellow members of the Jewish faith, it's kind of the 13-year-old, rite of passage of becoming bar mitzvah. Really, for many people, such as my father, who did have a bar mitzvah, that represents the, graduation from Judaism, the emancipation, when you're no longer required to do anything Judaically and you kind of throw things out. I never had that scenario. So I never was confronted with the really deep notion of, were there theological problems with the religion of Catholicism. But looking back, I don't think I was mature enough to really appreciate and attack it from a religious angle. And so my scientific objection was, well, the Catholic Church at the time still had not pardoned Galileo for the discoveries that he made with his 2-inch telescope, which he got from a 4-letter guy, Hans Lippershey from the Netherlands. He had made a copy of this telescope in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And Galileo, when he looked at the moon and the moons that go around Jupiter, he was led to the conclusion that the Earth must not be the only center of the solar system. And of course, the Vatican later persecuted him dreadfully for doing so. So when I found out about that, that was really kind of the last straw. I mean, I could put off the celibacy for a long time. I could, deal with some of the inconsistencies or whatever that I saw, but I couldn't really countenance what I saw as anti-intellectualism. And it actually wasn't until 1992 that Pope John Paul pardoned Galileo formally after 400 years nearly. So it was just astonishing to me. And so that led me, to lose my religion in that sense of Catholicism. And, I also always, think of it, because I think it's kind of shallow looking back on it, but I also think it's kind of shallow when you encounter what I call and what they call themselves, these militant atheists, the Dawkins, the Lawrence Krauses, the Carl Sagans, the Stephen Jay Goulds, maybe, although he's less so, or he was less so, but still the Sam Harrises. These are people that had Jewish educations up until age 13, and then they quit. And yet no Jewish scientist today would accept the math or physics proof from a 13-year-old uncritically. They would say, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the knowledge. I mean, I can imagine even a rare case. I mean, Einstein was in his mid-20s when he did what many people regard as the greatest work in physics. So I think it's possible to overstate the wisdom of a 13-year-old. So I don't take it as, well, I had so much wisdom at the time I could reject it, because I certainly didn't become religiously observant as a Jew at that time. That took much longer.
So what was that journey? I imagine you went into college, you went to Case Western, you said that to Brown, where I assume you pursued a PhD. And what was that? What was the journey like from there?
So going to college, I was, more or less a devout atheist. I was, basically, I felt like, well, if Christianity had some logical failures in it that I couldn't really deal with, or they had issues that I couldn't deal with, and if Christianity was based on Judaism, in my knowledge, right? The Old Testament, I mean, it's good marketing, right? The Old Testament, out with the old, in with the new. So just like, trigonometry, you could call trigonometry new geometry, right? So if you wanted, you could call geometry, properties of circles and squares and triangles, you call that old geometry, and you can call trigonometry new geometry. But then if somebody comes along and says, well, actually old geometry is wrong and it had this problem and blah, 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 that means necessarily that new geometry is wrong. Okay, so if A, then B, and if A is not provable or not A, then not B, right? But I also made the other logical fallacy that you say not B, then not A. And so I felt, well, if Christianity has these problems and flaws logically as I saw them, certain issues with inconsistencies with the Old Testament, et cetera, that I felt I don't have to believe in either one, because if the new and improved version is wrong, then the old and outdated and staid version is doubly wrong. So I was an atheist for many years, more than 15 years probably. And then after graduate school, I was working as a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford, and then I received a fellowship to be working at Caltech in Pasadena, California. So I moved west from Brown to Stanford in Northern California, then eventually south to Caltech. And if I keep going, from there I went to San Diego. Now I'm going to, next stop Tijuana. Exactly. And then, I did go pretty far south, as I'm sure we'll talk about. I actually went as far south as you can go many times in my life. But at any rate, getting back to my Jewish roots, when I came back to Judaism, it was really precipitated by September 11th, of all things, and really feeling like, that there were these forces arrayed. It kind of felt like, well, the Holocaust was, so many years ago, it wasn't really relevant, to me, and being in intellectual circles, especially in a liberal, Ivy League school, well, the, Israeli-Palestine conflict, you got to side with Palestinians, they're poor, oppressed people, and the Israels, are just kind of the victims of the Germans, and so now they're just doing to the poor Palestinian, so you get the all nonsense that you get on a modern college campus, Ivy League or not. You hear the same things here in San Diego or in Oklahoma, I assume. But then I started to see, well, what is going on? Why are there so many forces arrayed against, Jews, Israel? There's something important about this, this tiny, minuscule, infinitesimal part of the population. And what was that? And I wanted to explore more about it. And around that same time, my older brother had moved from he went to law school at Cardozo Law School, part of Yeshiva University. And he had moved out to the West Coast to live with me in Pasadena. And then he became a lawyer at a law firm. And there was a guy there who wore a kippah, and he got very interested in what's the kippah on your head? And the guy was like, well, you went to Yeshiva University Law. Like, didn't you meet any? He's like, yeah, all my best friends were rabbis, but they never had invited him over for Shabbat. They never, had him over for a holiday, anything like that. Even his rabbinical friends. And the outreach there was not so strong. But on the West Coast, it was very laid back, very relaxed. And not only did they invite my older brother to do things, he would invite me, and then I would start to learn. And as I said, this was just after September 11th. And it was just it was very exciting to go back. I had to, teach myself Hebrew. I read like a third grade robot that's broken half the time, but I can understand some of the biblical Hebrew and found it really fascinating. To my brother, it wasn't as fascinating. He was a lawyer, he was trained in legal disputations. And, once you do once you read through Tanakh or you read through the Torah, it's on to other more, it always seems like, well, now we're going to a PhD class, now you covered the undergraduate with the Torah, and now you're going, really, we only want you to study the really advanced stuff. And that really appealed to me, because I had never been burdened to have to do that for a case law class the way that he had. So for me, it was really exciting to learn who really does own a shmata that, two people find around a corner or whatever, that was really kind of a fascinating subject to me. And so I went to a summer program that was put on in Santa Barbara, California by Machon Shlomo Yeshiva.
Heritage Retreats.
That's right.
I was just with Rabbi Kreitenberg the other day.
Oh, wow. Well, If you see him, give him my best.
Yeah. What year was that you were there?
This is 2002, I think.
Okay. Because I was there in the summer of 2003.
Okay. Oh, maybe I was there with you. Yeah, summer of 2003. Let me think about that. Now, it must have been 2002, the summer of 2002. Yeah. Okay. But I went up there.
I'm happy to take credit either way. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You owe it all to me, Brian.
That's right. Yes, I'll send you the down payment later on. So yeah, and then I decided to go to Israel, and I went to Israel just for a couple of weeks around Hanukkah of 2003. No, 2002 it was, and decide for myself if I wanted to make the shift from Caltech, high stakes postdoc in astrophysics and cosmology, and leading this huge project that I was putting together, and see if I wanted to, take time off and learn. And I decided I didn't want to take time off and learn. And I went back to Caltech, but I always had this, very deep affinity and connection personally, spiritually, and professionally with Israel. And so, nowadays I have many, many collaborators that I work with in Tel Aviv and even in Ariel University, which is in the West Bank. So I've tried to keep up the connections and have the best of both worlds, which it's, thank goodness it's turned out to be. I've been quite lucky in many ways and blessed.
As you were growing, and of course, it sounds like your Jewish Renaissance, so to speak,
Yeah.
took place at an older age and a more advanced, more mature point intellectually in your life. So how did you at that point begin to reconcile some of the challenges that had earlier dissuaded you from religious life?
That's a good question. So, I hate it when people, compare themselves to Albert Einstein, but I'm actually going to compare myself to Albert Einstein, not in his physics. So he said once that what made him different and made him special was that he never asked questions of his parents about science. Like he never asked, why are rainbows the way they look? Why, or famously, what would happen if you traveled at the speed of light and looked at yourself in a mirror? Like he never asked himself, and he was thankful to the old one, as he would say, that he never asked those questions of his father, because nobody knew, right? Nobody knew until Einstein at age 25, right? So when Einstein at age 5, he asked his dad, his father could have only said, that's just the way it is, or, God does it like that. And he wouldn't have ever brought with it the intellectual apparatus, the toolkit that he later developed. And we certainly would have been delayed in getting a lot of the results that we later did get when he turned 25 and had this huge intellectual capacity and capability. For me, I'm not comparing myself intellectually with Einstein, but just that I didn't really think about religion until I was much, much older, until I was, my late 20s. And so it brought with me maybe not the Einstein level of religious, introspection, but it did lead me to approach it from a standpoint of I'm already established in my career. I'm already established as a scientist. I understand the scientific process. And I've read a lot more and I've experienced a lot more, whether it's, my adventures with Christianity, my daily interactions with people of other faiths, Baha'i, Islam, whatever. Just in academia, it's impossible not to meet such people, and really learning and growing and all the different traditions, and especially, being well-versed in atheist arguments, because that's the dominant, over 70% of the most prestigious, group of scientists in the world, arguably the National Academy of Sciences, are atheists. They don't believe, in a God, not just are agnostic. And I became, slowly, I think where I've transitioned to, I think, is a natural standpoint. I don't call myself, an Orthodox Jew, but I'm a practicing Jew. We observe Shabbat with my wife and kids. We attend an Orthodox synagogue, as I said earlier. I'm on the board of this Orthodox synagogue, and Judaism is a central part of my life. That said, I think, the thing that speaks to me most about Judaism is the willingness to question and the willingness to literally wrestle with the issues of God. And if you don't wrestle with those issues on a daily basis, I feel that you're not intellectually a serious person. I mean, you may think your case is so open and shut that there is no God that you no longer have to rely on it. But I think that's as religiously dogmatic as an Orthodox person or a devout Muslim or something like that. So I think at worst, or at least, a scientist should be a devout agnostic, in that they should be open to the possibility, for they should know better than anyone that you can't prove that there's no God, right? If you could prove that there's no God, just like if you can't prove that there is a God. I think that the most interesting thing is to explore the deepest mystery. So it's no accident that I study the origin of the universe, which is the one moment in time which may be forever hidden from us and may forever be a mysterious entity to comprehend. And yet I also think God is in that same category.
Wouldn't the average, member of that 70% National Academy of Sciences, wouldn't they respond to you, well, I don't need to disprove it. It's not within the realm of the perceptible or perceivable reality, the spaghetti monster or whatever the other, would be, I don't have to disprove. The burden of proof is on you.
Right. So I would say, well, I mean, is there a reason that you have to read Shakespeare? I mean, that would be the first level. I think there are many different arguments against such statements. But I think, one argument is, do you have to read Shakespeare? Of course not. You don't have to read anything. You don't even have to learn how to read. But I think reading enriches your life. I think intellectual, confronting intellectually issues that are not provable, that are open in many ways to growth, to a person being open to growth rather than being ossified. I think the aspects that are beneficial that have been, proven throughout history, just of the benefits of leading a religious life. And I don't mean the Pascal's wager where you act religious because just in case there's a God, then, like God is going to be tricked. Oh, well, like, and the rabbi, thought he was really, pulling a fast one on me, and it worked, he's in, come on up. But I think that was always kind of shallow. But I think, when you look at it, Stephen Hawking, Oliver Shalom, has passed away yesterday. And, I look at what he did, his greatest accomplishment in many ways was his book, A Brief History of Time. And that's a book that, is now again became a number one bestseller. And after 30 years after being in print the first time. So why is that interesting? Because he wrote this book that's endured and captivated the public. By the way, only 1% of the public has ever really read it cover to cover, and maybe half of them understood it cover to cover. But more than that, it shows the endurance of this idea that it lasted for 30 years. But now take a step back and look at, say, the Torah. The Torah's been around 100 times longer. And I hope to God, that nobody reads A Brief History of Time in 100 years, because I hope all the ideas have been superseded by better ideas. Just like now we don't talk about the ether. 100 years ago, there'd be a brief history of the ether, and it would be written by eminent scientists, Maxwell and Faraday and all sorts of people. So the job of science keeps subsuming and improving and correcting and getting rid of ideas. But if you have something that's been around for 30 centuries, it is something enduring that transcends the scientific realm. So I would say, you don't think about something in terms of its ability to be proven or disproven in a disputation. You look at, as a pragmatist, as a pragmatic realist, that you say, well, what benefits does this belief system have? Or at least if you don't believe in it, because you're afraid, that you'll then be encumbered to act upon those beliefs. If you don't, in that sense, then even if you just look at it as a work of scholarship, and I think, you have to be pretty sophistic to think that it's not a great work of literature. I know that there are, treatments and attacks of the Torah and even the New Testament, but let's just stick to the Old Testament, the Torah, because that's the book that you and I presumably know best of those two. But nevertheless, if you look at it, it's supremely deep and as a literary work. And I think the kind of attacks against it are typically straw men that are erected by people who don't want to have the obligation of practice. Because of that, they then burn the straw man that they created. But, there's no reason that I have to care about what they say. I mean, I think, the proof of the belief system is in the byproducts of that belief system. And if you look at the atheists, and there are happy atheists, there aren't many, and there are unhappy religious people. And there are people in the middle, agnostic, that can be in both worlds. But my complaint against those that are agnostic, and there are many wonderful agnostics, so these are people that are very open to Judaism being true, but they also don't go to the same synagogue that Richard Dawkins doesn't go to. There's no practical way, if you're an alien looking down at them, you could not distinguish, Richard Dawkins from my friends, say, Freeman Dyson, who's a wonderful. Actually, Freeman Dyson's a bad example because he does go to church every and he's a wonderful. But he's basically just is a practicing, non-believing Christian, and he's a very deep thinker. He won the Templeton Prize for his thoughts on science and religion. So. I think the proof is in the adherence. If you see the type of people that have a religious observance, and I don't think it's just this delusion. I think there are actual practical benefits. For one thing, with my children, when they come home and they say, "Well, somebody hit me," and I'm like, "Who did it?" No, I can't. That's gossip. I can't tell you. Or like, I'm going to get dressed, even though I really don't feel like going out. I say, why do you say that? He's like, well, I have to obey you. And there's something wonderful about that, in a sense, that kids really crave it. They crave the discipline and authority. And all this is not to say that religion doesn't have a lot of challenges that I think a lot of its adherents don't face up to. But I think that there's work to be done on both sides of the theist and non-atheist debate.
How have you dealt with sort of the basic perceived contradictions between general cosmology and religious doctrine or theological assertions of origin of the universe, age of the universe, things of that nature? What's your manner of synthesizing it or just reconciling?
Yeah. So, I always say, like, if you look at the Torah and you count the number of lines dedicated to what one could plausibly call cosmology or creation, it's under 30 verses of, Genesis 1. And then if you count the total number of, Pesukim verses in the entire, it's 35,000. So you're talking about something that's 0.1% of the total. So I ask you, you pick up a book and it says, great Jewish sports stars, and it's a 1,000-page book. It's not the Monty Python version. But then you read it, and it's all about the NBA, and then there's a couple of guys, Jewish guys in the NBA. It's clearly not about Jewish sports stars. The title is misleading, and I think people put the Torah into, they pigeonhole it. If you see a book that's mostly now, why does it start with those verses? As famous Rashi, why doesn't it start with all these laws? I mean, most of the book of the Torah most of the 5 books of the Pentateuch are about, laws of this, small set of nomadic people living in the Middle East, right? So why didn't it start with the 10 Commandments or as Rashi says, and this is the first moon of all your moons of your calendar, which I like too, because both Genesis 1 and Rashi's claim of what should have been Genesis 1 both have astronomical links to them. So I personally like that aspect. No matter where you go, there's astronomy. But getting back to, it's true that the Torah does start with that. Why does it start with Genesis? Why does it start with what you might say is cosmology? And clearly, I think, the way that the Torah speaks is meant to do this magic trick that Stephen Hawking will likely never be able to pull off, which is to be relevant in its age and then to be relevant 30 centuries, 50 centuries, whatever. I mean, you can't imagine how long a period of time that is. I just wrote a book and I'm hoping it'll sell copies, a couple hundred copies, a couple thousand, whatever. And then, but 100 years, 10 years, who knows what it will sell. And just as a proxy for reading it. So why did it do that? Well, because it had to speak to people 3,000 years ago too. I mean, it wasn't, the beginning of the universe in my great grandmother's religion was, Baal worship, whatever it was. There were all these gods that created the universe and made all these different things happen and made the rain and made thunder and made wind, etc. So it had to speak to them and say, no, actually, not even the sun, which was the number one god in Egypt, the most powerful, the sun god, sun was created. And it wasn't even created in the beginning. It wasn't even created on the first day. It was created on the 4th day. And so I think, if it's clear that people who want to read it literally have an agenda, they want to prove that it's silly, that it's antiquated, it's arcane. But I think if you look at what it was trying to do, and that it can still speak to us today. Because if you don't want to believe that it literally describes 24-hour periods, then you can say, well, it's a scientific allegory. It's an allegory, rather. It's not scientific. It's showing progression, forms. It has a message to teach us, but it's not a book about evolution. It doesn't mention RNA in it. Okay, fine. It wasn't talking. People didn't know what that was. And if they talk about right now, if I show you this 4-dimensional iPad, that they're going to have in 100 years, you're not going to understand that either. Does that mean that all the stuff that you're doing today didn't happen? So I think, there's the whole notion of, God of the gaps. I think it's pretty simplistic. And I think it's a shallow intellectual way to look at things that you don't want to grapple with. And if you can't grant your opponent in a debate the benefit of the doubt that there was a message to everything that it says, you might not agree with it, but you would grant that same benefit of the doubt to a Shakespeare scholar, I think that you're not a real intellect.
I want to transition to the book that you've written and really to the story behind the book. You referenced earlier that you've been very, very south, and south of Tijuana, you noted, and that you wrote a book with a very provocative title called Losing the Nobel Prize. So tell us the story behind your travels and this larger journey that has involved the Nobel Prize as it involved kind of your overarching scientific pursuit.
Yeah. So the title of the book really is sort of a double entendre. It really, in the beginning, it was meant to convey the fact that I had participated in this, a scientific experiment, which at one moment in time, exactly 4 years ago, many people around the world claimed was going to win not only a Nobel Prize for people involved with it, but specifically I was going to win a Nobel Prize. And that wasn't far from my original motivation in creating the experiment, to look for the very first birth pangs of the universe that we were told would be indicative of this period of what's called inflation, when the universe expanded faster than the speed of light, a microsecond after its birth, or after its origin, if you will, and that would leave an imprint in its wake, basically distorting the fabric of space-time. And that we saw this imprint of these waves of gravity on the most ancient light ever available in the universe, called the cosmic microwave background radiation. To see that pattern, we wanted to go somewhere where the light from the early universe that had been traveling for 13.82 billion years to reach Earth, we didn't want that to travel into the Earth, hit a water molecule in the Earth's atmosphere, and get absorbed and lost forever. So ideally, water absorbs microwaves, and that's how your microwave oven works. Your microwave oven doesn't heat up the carbon and everything in the food. It heats up the water, and the water heats up everything else. And most of the food's mostly water. So water absorbs microwaves. So we want to go somewhere where there's very little water. And most people say, well, why don't you just go to space? And I say, well, why don't you give me $1 billion? Because it costs about $1 billion to build, a decent satellite to do the kind of science that we wanted to do.
Yes, Elon Musk wasn't around offering at the time.
Yeah, that's right. He was not. It was 2004, 2005. And so I came up with an idea that we could build a small telescope, very similar in concept to Galileo's original telescope. And instead of looking through it with your eye, we'd put very sensitive detectors at the focus of this telescope. And instead of observing from Padua, from Tuscany, as Galileo was fortunate to do in his, in his T-shirt and jean, whatever he was wearing, his cloak, his frock, we had to go to the driest place on Earth, which was the South Pole, Antarctica. And the United States has a base there, owned by the United States, because and only because we do scientific research there. Astronomy, we study the atmosphere. My colleagues study neutrinos. They study all sorts of crazy and interesting, fun science, not just astronomy. And because of that, we have a base there that's, it's a pretty good size. It's about 100,000 square foot base there. And then we have these little satellite outposts where we can build telescopes on the snowpack. And
is it hard to get access over there? In other words, do you have to be on a waiting list? Do you have to apply? Do you have to?
Yeah.
How do you get in?
Yeah, you can only go there. You can't, open a Starbucks down there. You can only do scientific research in the entire continent. So the entire continent right now, it's the beginning of, it's getting to be fall. It's almost winter. So anyone who's there in Antarctica right now in March of 2018 is going to be there until probably October, November. There's no flights in or out. There are no boats in or out. The weather's, just completely a nightmare to travel. It's so cold that if you were to land a plane at the South Pole in the middle of winter, the plane would be destroyed forever because all the fluids in it, all the oils, all the fuel in it would expand and crack and break the engine and break the lines, and the plane would be rendered useless. So they don't like to do any flights down there in the winter. And so to get there, you need to go on a military plane, and you're only able to go there in the austral southern summertime. So I went in December and January of both, two times, about 10 and 8 years ago or so. And I was able to stay there for a couple of weeks with my graduate students and my postdocs and collaborators at Harvard and Caltech and Stanford and other places.
And they ship food in there? Like, how do people survive?
Yeah. Well, so when I went there, I was the first person to keep Shabbos there, to put on tefillin at the South Pole.
Wow.
It was Hanukkah the first time I was there, which was also Xmas as well. And that was in 2005, 2006. And so I brought a dreidel because I wanted to see if the dreidel spins the other way.
It's like the Australian toilets, right?
That's right. There's only the toilets. So I brought all these self-heating kosher meals made by La Brute. Wow. So it was funny because they let me, usually you can only bring one suitcase. Space is a real premium down there, even though it's wide open. But to get stuff down there costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars, per person if you were to pay for it. So we didn't pay anything. All we do is go from San Diego to LA to a very rich Jewish city, rich with Jewish tradition in New Zealand called Christchurch. And that's where we left from on a cargo plane to Antarctica. And I was there for the better part of the month of December, the first time I was there, and then January, February, the second time.
And so what did you experience there from a scientific perspective?
So we were there to build and install the telescope because I said you can't get stuff in or out 9 months of the year, essentially. So you have to get everything is compressed into 3 months. And during those 3 months, the sun never sets once. The sun is just making a slow circle arching over your head, taunting you and never setting. And the only thing you can see that reminds you that there's something changing is sometimes the moon comes up. The moon still rises and sets, but the sun doesn't rise or set but once per year, which is pretty nice for us because we get to advertise that for the guy that spends a year of his life or her life down there. We say, we're going to pay you $75,000 and all you have to do is one night of work. Okay. It's not a big deal. Of course, that takes 6 months of calendar time to do that. So we ended up building the telescope, installing it, testing it, making sure it's going to work. And this telescope operates like no other telescope, not like my mom's the telescope she got me. It works at near absolute zero, and it's using detectors that are made of very advanced materials that can see the heat left over from Barry sheet from the Big Bang. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for particles of light called photons, and on these photons will be imprinted the imprimatur, the signal of the earliest moments of the universe, hypothetically called inflation. And the logical argument that has been made is that if we were to prove that inflation occurred, then it would be proof as close as you could get to proof that the multiverse is true. So we don't have time to discuss the mathematics behind that, but suffice it to say that almost all adherents of the multiverse hypothesis believe that the one prerequisite for it to be true is that there was a period known as inflation. And that inflationary period will make an imprint on these radio microwaves from the Big Bang that I looked for.
Was it a strange phenomenon, being a believer, so to speak, or a theologically disposed person, potentially proving the multiverse theory, which is the one sort of undermining potential theory?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because we did discover it, or so we thought. And that's kind of the main crux of the book and how that came to be, and the scientific forces that compelled us to do such a thing and to say such a thing, and the psychological forces and the competitive forces. The Nobel Prize is a very overarching character in the book. I don't think it was ever far from any of our minds that could be a possibility. So I think, on a practical sense, when you're down there, you're thinking mostly about, do I need to put on this pair of gloves to turn this Allen wrench or not? And then when you get back and you're flying over this huge continent that, dozens of people died trying to get to where you were escorted to, chauffeured to by the United States government in such comfort and ease, then you can reflect. Then you can literally reflect on what you had accomplished and what you had done and the possibilities that it might lead to, this glimpse of a vista of a time before time began. And I wouldn't say that the multiverse would invalidate God's existence, though I would say its alternative would be very interesting to think about its implications. So the on one side, Superman is the multiverse. The other side, Lex Luthor, is something called the bouncing or cyclic cosmology, which has really been around almost, forever, no pun intended, but it suggests that our universe is essentially the byproduct of a previous universe's demise. So our universe's origin came about thanks to the death throes of a previous universe collapsing in on itself with an unimaginable fiery furnace that then provided the raw materials of energy and matter to create in a bounce our universe. And that would be, I think, might be more problematic, although there are suggestions in the Talmud that God
worlds destroyed and worlds created.
Yeah, so I think, and it was interesting because when we did pronounce that we made this discovery of inflation, of the multiverse, evidence for the multiverse perhaps, people around the world, both, Jewish, Christian, all sorts of scholars around the world in theological circles were saying it was evidence for their, brand of thinking. And then there were the atheists like Lawrence Krauss who were saying, oh no, this is final proof that we don't need supernatural shenanigans, as he always derisively refers to them, to explain how the universe came to be. It actually came about as a quantum fluctuation from nothing. And so this BICEP, my experiment, was called BICEP, and that BICEP experiment has validated that there is no God. And so it's interesting, and I think that will always be the case. I think people will always be able to find suggestions. When the Big Bang was discovered, it was discovered by one of the two discoverers, Arno Penzias, discovered the heat left over from the Big Bang. He was an observant Jew, and he still is. And he always felt like he wanted to be agnostic about it, although he had felt, and his collaborator felt, that the most compelling explanation before their discovery was that the universe had always been around. Not that it was created from a cycle, but that it was basically a static, eternal universe.
Aristotelian,
Yeah, Aristotelian. Einstein believed that too. In some sense. So how could you get the static, steady state universe? And I go through kind of the battles that took place back then and the battles that took place when we made our announcement, which is kind of the heir to the steady state versus Big Bang debate, is the multiverse versus the cyclic universe debate. And I claim, we're going to keep seeing these throughout history because ultimately it may be that the traces of the smoking gun, of the universe's origin are destined to always remain hidden from our view. But that's okay. And I think, as John Wheeler said, ignorance is like an island, and you want to make the island, have as big a coastline as possible, because you want to expand your body of the island of knowledge, expand it. And the ignorance, so there'll be more and more things. The more I learn, the more I know I don't know. And I think that sense of humility is important to keep in mind. That will never reach the end of these debates. And there can be more than one mystery. There can be the mystery of the universe. There can be the mystery of a God. And then within each one of those, is God a personal God? Is God an all-knowing? Is he all-powerful? And then on the science side, we go back to a microsecond, a nanosecond, a trillionth of a second. So can you always find more and more things to study? That to me is the unifying principle behind the two halves of my being, as a spiritually practicing person and as a religious scientist, in the sense that I am fervent about studying the universe with the tools that we have at our disposal.
What would be the protheistic interpretation of multiverse?
I haven't given that so much thought. I mean, I think that as I said, the multiverse has several problems with it, in that it predicts this profligate universe with innumerable cosmoses that are not only somewhere, more than one or two, but actually maybe a billion, or maybe 100 billion, or maybe an infinite number.
Infinite, right.
So if you have an infinite number, how do you explain, the origin of us? So you'd have to say that we are not unlikely, that you and I are having this conversation, except I'm interviewing you and wearing the headphones in this conversation, right? And that's happening an infinite number of times. And then you can ask the question, well, can you actually falsify such a notion? Can you prove it? Most people think science is about proving something right. Like, I have an idea, eureka, and I'm going to go out and prove it. Use the scientific method, check, hypothesis, synthesis, like you learn in high school. And then you get the answer at the bottom. That's not really the way science works. It has elements of that in true science, but not, that's not the sum total of it. So I think, when you look back on how you could actually prove or disprove whether the multiverse occurred, you'd have to, really, if you're honest, you'd have to say at some level it is an issue of faith. There are people that want to believe that the multiverse is true. And some of it may be not only faith, just, casually as a scientist, like, I believe that these laws are so elegant that they must be true. But more that, well, I don't believe that there's a God. I actually believe that there is no God. And this comports with that argument that the universe can spontaneously generate itself as a quantum fluctuation from nothing. And I think that those arguments are intrinsically intellectually dishonest in a sense, because I think they're driven by a desire to prove something, not necessarily to disprove something. And that, I think, is the latter being the more position of integrity.
What happened with the experiments you did? You alluded to what seemed to be like this great discovery, perhaps wasn't what it was made out to be, and tell us sort of the conclusion of that story.
So we had, sought this signal for the better part of a decade, and after building two experiments to go after this very same signal, we found that we could not explain the signal by any other means other than the inflationary origin of the universe. And in doing so, we really set off inside of our collaboration with Harvard and Caltech and Stanford and other institutions. We set off this inexorable series of events that were, the inertia to release, of the pressure to produce. It's almost like, I once heard, like a mother cow wants to give milk more than the cow wants to drink the milk, or an artist wants to make the art more than the consumer wants to buy it or see it even. And once you got in that mold as a scientist, our currency, I always say scientists are kind of like small business people. I mean, we have profit and loss, we have incoming funds, we have to pay out things, we have travel expenses, personnel, hiring, firing, but we also have to teach 20 hours a week, which can kind of crimp our style, which, I don't think Tim, what's his name at Apple, has to teach 20 hours a week, but Tim Cook. But anyway, the inertia behind this announcement became too difficult to really stop. And many of us thought there could be problems with the analysis and there could be an issue. Most prominent of all, ironically, was what I call the most humble substance in the universe, which is dust. So, this isn't dust that like your vacuum cleaner picks up. This is actually the byproduct of an exploded sun or an exploded star that left its detritus scattered throughout the universe. And if you've ever seen a meteorite, you ever gone to a museum and you've seen a metallic meteorite, you might have known that these things are very heavy, they're very dense, and they're very magnetic. And when you have tiny bits of those meteorites called micrometeorites, tons and tons of which the Earth plows through every day, these meteorites can get aligned in space when they're still meteoroids. They can get aligned by the magnetic field of the solar system, of the galaxy, etc. And in so doing, they can emit and absorb light and produce an exact mimic signal of the inflationary signal. And so the humblest substance in the universe, the smallest substance in the universe in the sense, presented a signal that exactly was mimicking the signal that we were seeking. And along the way, many of us were concerned about it. But in the end, we actually had done several different tests. So we did all these different tests to confirm that it wasn't dust. And the more tests we did, the more and more sure we got that it wasn't dust. And we went down this path. Eventually, it was essentially all but proven that it had to be dust, or dust was equally likely as the signal that we saw. And this had come after these whispers of Nobel Prizes and just worldwide attention. Millions, tens of millions of people watched this announcement in the spring of 2014. And so needless to say, it took time, but what ended up happening was really an amazing glimpse into the scientific process, scientific personalities, and the psychology of being a scientist. And as I said in the beginning, scientists are humans. They're not immune to the forces that cause humans to stray, right? So what does the Shema say, the credo of the Jewish people? It says, do not prostitute yourself. Do not follow your eyes and your heart and the desires of your heart that lead you astray. And I always add like ashtray because the dust is kind of like smoke. It's like the ash in an ashtray. And literally we saw what we wanted to see because we knew not only would it win a Nobel Prize for us, but more to the point that we would really confirm and prove this theory of cosmogenesis beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that the whole episode shows science in a true light as an insider that I was to it. And then later coming to grips with, and then ironically and just completely serendipitously, I was asked the following year after this whole affair kind of came to a denouement, I was asked to nominate the winners of the next year's Nobel Prize. And, I thought about nominating myself. That'll be good. But they actually say you cannot nominate yourself. So I was one of the people asked to nominate the winners.
It's too bad we hadn't met yet, Brian.
Yeah, that's right. You could have put in a good word. I could have slipped you the invitation. So when I went through that process, I found it appalling because the Nobel Prize, is basically what we in Hebrew call a tzava'ah, like an ethical will. And it's the same sort of a benediction, a blessing, if you will, but also, a wish for the future of one's progeny or one's, material wealth in as specific a fashion as could possibly be imagined. Alfred Nobel said, I want this done with my money to go to these specific types of people every year. And I had found that when they asked me to nominate the winners, they said, oh, ignore what he said in his will. And we know what we want you to do. And here's what we want you to do. And it had very little to do with what Alfred Nobel specified. And as you know, one of the 613 commandments is to never leave the dead unescorted. And that's because, one of the reasons that it's such an important mitzvah is that it's something that you can never be repaid for. So, somebody dies and you escort them, they're never going to pay you back, right? They're not going to take care of your body after you die. So conversely, scientifically, logically, not obeying what they want to do specifically in their express written will and testament, that is one of the worst things you could possibly do because there's nothing they can do to you. You're disavowing what they had wanted to do. And Alfred Nobel had no children. He never married. He had no offspring. And so this was the closest thing that he had. And I felt the almost ethical obligation to do that. And in doing so, found my own version of an ethical will and what I wanted to have my children, my biological children, my ideological children, my 9 PhD students, what I want them to most remember me by, hopefully at 120, right?
Which would be what?
That I would want them to really see things like the accolades the awards, the distinctions, as sort of, I came to find that the Nobel Prize is a sort of form of avodah, that it's actually tantamount to a religion, as close as the 70% of these scientists who are atheists will ever get to a religion. It's the Nobel Prize, because the Nobel Prize has all the elements that Judaism has, or Christianity. It has a high priesthood. It has the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. It has the saints, the prophets, the Nobel laureates who are sanctified and elevated to such heights. It has, of course, many holidays. It has the feast of coronation, which takes place when Alfred Nobel died, not on his birthday. It's kind of weird. And then, of course, it has its catechism, which is, to benefit all mankind, very lofty catechism instead of Our Father or the Shema. And then it has something that, Judaism doesn't have, but it has golden graven images. It has, it's instead of a crucifix or an icon, it has a likeness of Alfred Nobel on one side and two goddesses on the other side. And you literally bow down to the king of Sweden and you receive it. And I saw that in sharp relief, maybe just to close out, my encounter with this prize. When I'd written this book, as I said, it was a double meaning. It meant basically my search for the Nobel Prize that had been rendered unto dust. And then there was my feeling that the Nobel Prize needs to be gotten rid of, and it's lost in its current form. We need to lose it and improve it to reform it for its own betterment. And so I looked at it, and I had been railing against the Nobel Prize for a year. And then in May of 2017, a man named Duncan Haldane, who won the 2016 Nobel Prize that I nominated, not him, unfortunately, I nominated other people for. So he won the Nobel Prize in 2016, the year that I was asked to nominate. And he came to UCSD, where he had been a professor when he did his Nobel Prize winning work. And not only did he give a brilliant, wonderful lecture, but he brought with him his Nobel Prize. He brought with him the very, golden graven image that I had been railing against for more than a year at that point. And I saw people gathering around him, and he was, obviously enjoying it. And I have no problems with the Nobel Prize winners, obviously, but the people, they gathered, they were kissing it, they were posing for selfies with it. And then something happened, and I had it in my hand, and then all of a sudden I had my iPhone in front, and I took a picture of me with it. and I realized, I used to think that the story of the golden calf was like totally ridiculous in the Torah. Like, how could these Jews who were supposed to be, we're so full of ourselves, that we're so smart and so much better, and 30% of Nobel Prize winners are Jews, and we're so proud of it, and we're so logical and rational. And I was like, how could they go out of the desert after, these 10 amazing supernatural plagues and miracles and splitting of the sea? How could they go out and then 40 days later or whatever, a few weeks later, then bow down to worship an icon of gold that they themselves made? They're so stupid. But, it's something that is deeply inherent in human beings. And that's another way that I think, the Torah is relevant. 3,000 years ago, if you were to predict, well, what will 3,000 years from now people really worship? Will they worship, college education, a Harvard degree? My son and daughter are going to Harvard or UCSD or whatever. Or, will they have, it's a Ferrari? Or no, it's not going to be. There's always going to be something that the human being will worship and will elevate to the status of idolatry. And for scientists, ironically, who are atheists, I think it's interesting that they sort of disavow this, and they would never say that they worship something, but many of them do. And the story of my book is partially a reckoning of myself as a scientist, one who did want to win it almost at all costs for many reasons, and not the least of which because it does convey upon person the status of a god within physics. I mean, there are more people that have walked on the moon and traveled through space on the space station and space shuttles than have won the Nobel Prize. There's more, living people that have been in space than are living Nobel Prize winners in physics. So it's quite an amazing accolade. I think it's the highest honor that society has. And I wanted to, sort of expose what it's doing to scientists and young people especially. And I hope I've done that.
Wonderful. Just in wrapping up, I'm just so curious from a personal perspective, how did it impact you? Was it painful? Was it embarrassing to feel like you were there and then millions of people lauding and then all of a sudden, oh, actually not? That sense of, just kidding, psych. Yeah. I mean, how did that impact you personally, emotionally? That must have been difficult.
Yeah. Well, so I describe how it did affect me emotionally and how the Nobel Prize affects other people generally, psychologically, I think. But by the time, these things had kind of come to a conclusion, I was a different person than when I created the experiment in the first place. When I created the experiment in the first place, a lot of it was driven by, this was a sure path to getting tenure. Winning a Nobel Prize doesn't hurt your tenure case. And, by then I had long been tenured and received, a fair amount of nice accolades and praise. And I just become much more comfortable than I was when I was younger. It's like when you think about what do they say on the Oscars? They had the Oscars recently, and the woman gets up or the guy gets up and says, "This goes to show you that you too can win an Oscar." But if you think about it, that's not really true, right? I mean, there's 300 million people in America. There's one Oscar winner, so maybe 150 million men, 150 million women, and so the odds are pretty well. So there are more people that don't win, is the point, and there are more people. So I had felt that there's so many books. There are actually like a half a dozen books written how to win a Nobel Prize. And I think it's totally ridiculous. I mean, they're silly. They're written by guys or women who have won Nobel Prizes or just kind of as a joke, like, oh, you have to be a white man, whatever. And
Right.
But I want to write, and the ones written by the Nobel laureates are plentiful. And there's hundreds of books written by Nobel laureates. And those are always the victory lap, I call it. That's the victory lap book. Here I am running around the stadium with the gold medal literally around my neck. But more people don't win it, and more people are left out of it. And it has this effect. So on one hand, that was almost a relief to be unburdened from this constant quest to win a Nobel Prize. Now it's like I say, if they want to see if I'm sincere about all the proposals that I have to reform and revitalize the Nobel Prize, and if they want to see if I would even accept it, they can offer it to me and see if I'm sincere. And if I turn them down, then no, I'm sincere. So that's a challenge to the Royal Academy. But
I'll convey that challenge.
But on the deeper level, for the embarrassment factor, I was definitely trying to be a voice of reason early on and urging maybe less sensationalism than other collaboration members were. But I do feel like, I definitely was caught up in it myself. But the good thing about science, it's not like the legal system. So there's no like double jeopardy. So if you make a mistake in science and you come clean and you admit it, and in our case, it really wasn't a blunder. It wasn't like we measured something as going faster than the speed of light and we are never going to turn, we actually, didn't connect the cables or we didn't take the lens cap off the telescope. That didn't happen. We actually have more confidence than ever. It's gone in, the significance of the signal has gone from it being, 1 part in 30 million as a statistical fluke, as a fluctuation, as an explanation, to like maybe 1 part in 100 million or so. So the signal is there and it's very prominent. But the question is, how do you remove the contribution from that humble, the schmutz of the solar system, this cosmic dust? And how do you get rid of it is now the subject of a whole new set of experiments that I'm very privileged to be leading, called the Simons Observatory. And this is a project with about 200 collaborators. So this would really give the Nobel Committee fits because they have this stupid unwritten rule that they can only give it to 3 people, which Alfred Nobel never said anything about. Just one of the many things that they do wrong. But nevertheless, the collaborators that I'm working with from all around, all 7 continents, actually, we're building an experiment that will eventually be located in the northern Atacama Desert of Chile at an altitude of over 17,000 feet. So it's so high up, you're over half the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. So you have to wear an oxygen mask, cannula in your nose like you would in a hospital or something like that. And it's just an otherworldly landscape. I have a telescope that's operating there currently. We're going to upgrade it, and this telescope will have something like 50 times the power of the BICEP telescope. So it'll be able to do in a year, what would have taken BICEP 50 years to do. And I think it's going to be a spectacular thing because we are now looking at not only what we want to see, if you say we want to see inflation, we want to see the multiverse, we're also looking for the schmutz, and we're paying attention to this most mercurial force in the universe, which is very poorly understood, even though the Earth is essentially a giant dust ball, and it's orbiting a star, and it's surrounded by many other dust clouds and dust balls and nebula and all sorts of things. But in summary, I go back to my hero Galileo, who we began discussing. Galileo looked through his telescope. He saw this constellation, asterism rather, called the Pleiades, which you may recognize as Subaru. On the hood of cars, you see these, they're called the Seven Sisters. There are actually 6 of them that are bright enough to see with the naked eye. And so if you've ever seen the hood ornament on a Subaru, that's what they look like. And he looked at them, but he saw them through his telescope differently than he saw them with the naked eye. And what he was seeing, and she didn't know, was tiny particles of dust that were scattering the light of the stars that were embedded within this dust. He claimed that the glowing nebula was actually due to stars that he couldn't see. And he wanted to say that. He wanted that to be true because it would mean that not only is the Earth just another planet, well, the sun is just another star in the Milky Way, and the whole Milky Way is made up of stars. So it wasn't as big a blunder maybe as we made. But if the greatest scientist who ever lived, the first astronomer in history to use a telescope, if he can make a blunder and trip on the dust, then we're in pretty good company.
Wow. Wonderful conclusion. And I think that your tale in general is one that encompasses certainly aspiration and brilliance and a lot of wonderful positive qualities, but also equally and probably more important qualities of humility and open-mindedness and personal growth and evolution. And I think that's really not just a testament to your scientific acumen, but to your character and to your representation of your Judaism and your faith. So thank you for sharing that with us. Where can we find this book? Tell us a little bit about that.
So it is available on Amazon.com. You can contact me through my website, briankeating.com, BrianKeating.com. We also have established an online community called losingthenobelprize.org, all one word. And that is dedicated to proposing, the seekers, the dreamers, the people that were left out in the past, and also to petition to the Royal Academy of Sweden and Norway that they do teshuva, that they beware for themselves. Because in a lot of ways, there's, sometimes change comes from within, and that can be very beneficial. And sometimes, like Jeremiah, the community can rail against things that aren't right in an attempt to overthrow things to make them better for the community.
Have they responded to any of these overtures? Or did they just not listen to you at all?
They've responded. There's so the national identity of Sweden is very much connected to the Nobel Prize. It's the days that it's given out are basically a holiday. Sweden is one of the most secular countries in Europe and indeed in the world. And so it is almost like national religion for them. So they're very reluctant. They get billions of dollars, and kind of media attention, and hundreds of millions of people watch it online or in person. It's very important to the national pride of the countries. They're very reluctant to change anything. No substantive change has occurred to the Nobel Prize in over 40 years, since 1974. And I think it's quite detrimental to the prestige. I think eventually, you've seen reform come to politics. You've seen, just one example, no woman has won the Nobel Prize in physics in over 50 years, and only 2 total in history. And I think that's grossly misrepresenting how the modern science looks and how it acts today. And I think all it's going to take is 1 or 2 male Nobel Prize winners to boycott or turn down the prize. And that's happened. The Nobel Peace Prize has been sued by winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, Bishop Tutu and others. My complaints should really be taken as a love letter in some sense, and as a hopeful guide rather than a polemic to just tear it all down, because I don't think that would be in the best interest. At worst, it's doing tremendous damage to science, and at best, it's a kind of a harmless game that people play. But I think change is going to come, and change is painful, but reformation can be a very good thing too.
Again, just to reiterate, I think that is echoed both in your scientific work and in terms of your personal development. And I think it's a lesson we can all take for our own lives, all of us listening, that notion of constant improvement and evolution in our lives. So thank you very much, Dr. Brian Keating.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Ari Koretsky on Jews You Should Know. Please visit us at JewsYouShouldKnow.com and subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume podcasts. Find us on social media at Jews You Should Know. If you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate that, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Jews You Should Know. Finally, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review so that we can continue to grow and introduce many more people to Jews You Should Know.